Welcome to Realance Radio, the podcast that explores how regenerative paradigms, principles, and practices are being brought to life in communities all around the world. In this season, we are exploring regeneration in action. We are showing how regenerative principles become tangible, rooted in soil, culture, and community.
Now, I'm one of your hosts, James, alongside Boris-Karloff Batata, and in today's episode, we're focusing on a practice that is very ancient, but with real lessons for a future of food production that is climate-friendly and biodiversity boosting. We're talking about food forestry.
When we hear the words agriculture or farming, we might imagine plow fields, annual crops, and landscapes that need to be dug, replanted each year.
But regenerative movements like permaculture and agroecology remind us that nature rarely grows in monocultures. Forests with their layers of canopies, understories, shrubs, herbs, roots, fungi, and ground cover are some of the most resilient and rich ecosystems on Earth. Food forestry, sometimes called a forest garden, works with these layers to create perennial, multi-story food systems that mimic natural forests.
These systems build soil, support biodiversity, nourish communities, and regenerate ecosystems over time. Today, we are joined by two people who are deeply immersed in this work. Please welcome Sanjana Krishnan, mother, academic researcher, and founder of Beachvan, a not-for-profit organization leading in research and practice of restoring sacred forests in India. And we have Rakesh Rootsman Rak, a permaculture teacher, reggae DJ, designer, and community organizer based in the UK. I can't wait to dive into this conversation with you both. I'd love to start by hearing a bit about your context and how you each arrived at food forestry. Maybe we'll start with Sanjana. Beachvan's work includes the restoration of sacred forests. Can you paint us a picture? How did this journey begin with you?
Thank you, Boris, for asking me that question and for the introduction. There are many layers to Beachvan. Let me break down the word for you. Beachvan comes from multiple Indian languages. It's derived from two words, Beej meaning seed and Van meaning forest. And the work essentially began long before the organization existed in its current form. It started with a very personal quest for home, for clean food, for clean water, and a sense of safety for myself, my family, my kids, which actually took me back to the Sahyadri valleys where I've worked in the last 5 years now here. And returning there almost after 3 decades of being there, felt like returning to an old truth. And over time, I realized that my quest for finding home isn't necessarily a place, but a state of being. And Beachvan grew out of that realization. It's not a location, but an idea that holds transition, belonging, much like the forest itself. Also, the spark, the second layer of it is that when I visited, my first visit to a sacred grove, which we call Devrai here in Maharashtra, is Devrai also translates literally as the abode of the gods or the home of gods. I realized that most Devrais are slowly disappearing. These are centuries old, protected by communities. They hold not just biodiversity, but cultural memory and a deep spiritual relationship between humans and nature. So I remember standing in one of these devrais, which was not more than a few acres, couple of acres at most. Yet it felt like entering into a different cosmos, another world. The air was cooler. I could hear birds that I'd never heard before. There were calls of birds which were strikingly different inside these groves. And at the same time, there were signs of encroachment right at the edges of these little forests. And that contrast is a picture and an image which has stayed with me throughout. So I think Beachvan was born in that moment from an inner attunement to the forest herself. And I realized that if people understood the ecological and cultural significance of these groves and these little forests, they could be protected and conserved. So that's when I also transitioned and started working in villages with the farming communities, with youth, and also the government officials in local bodies there. So we learned together that, okay, these are the species that have been lost and then co-created restoration plans for this little 2-acre demonstration farm, as we called it then, that honored traditional ecological knowledge. As of today, Bijwan's work is so much more about cultural revival as much as ecological restoration. So we have restored this 2-acre barren patch into a thriving community forest. It's a space today where all species come and go as they need to. I personally no longer live at the farm anymore, but it now belongs to and is cared for by the farming families in the village. And the kids love it there. It's also a library, a space for study and learning and fun and so much more. And I've transitioned into a role as an academic more seriously as a political scientist, as a practitioner of ecology. But my commitment remains to the same, to restore as many sacred groves as possible in this lifetime and to connect with communities around the world who live around sacred forests, so to say. I know that there are thousands globally, probably more, and it's fascinating for me to explore this interconnected world of its own. And what began as a personal search for home has grown into a collective journey today for me to protect these spaces, the wisdom that keeps us rooted, and so much more. Yeah, thank you.
Now, Rakesh, you've been teaching permaculture and forest gardening for many years across Europe and beyond. What first drew you to perennial food systems?
Thanks. Lovely question. So I guess, first of all, I grew up in a very poor part of East London, in a poor family. My father was working with different charity organizations, helping in like cyclones and earthquakes. And he went to Skopje in the 1960 and the big earthquake that happened there. And from there, he got invited to England. And so he came with hardly anything in his pocket, no resources, no wealth, and pretty much just started from there. So we grew up in a poor part of East London, and we just basically had to work out how to make ends meet. And so growing food was logical. It was it was an obvious thing to do, so we'd grow our own food, build our own furniture. If we needed anything, we would work out how to do it ourselves, and make our own clothes and so on and so forth. And anything broke, we would fix it ourselves. So growing food was kind of, I remember when my mum gave me my first cucumber plant at the age of something like 4, and just watching this thing come to life and start to sprout and have leaves and then grow and get bigger and start to have flowers, and then a fruit started growing, and then, oh my, wow, and then you can eat this. This is like so fascinating. It was like, wow, and so this absolute wonderment. And I don't know, 50 something years old now. I'm still like that. I'm still like that little 4-year-old, just in complete wonderment of this world and really wanted to know how things work. And so obviously as life gets on, you don't have so much time for growing food in the back garden. And I also obviously moved away and so on and so forth. And I noticed that my parents, they really loved the garden. They loved gardening. They loved watching the animals, the squirrels and the birds and hedgehogs and whatever would pass through the garden. So, but every time they would grow things, I could see, as they were digging, they were kind of, complaining about all the aches and pains in their bodies of digging and weeding and this, that, and the other. So I just put my mind to thinking, well, how can we design work out of the food growing system? And so that got me to really study nature. I'd already been studying nature. I went to a school which was really rough, extremely violent, extremely racist. And so my strategy to survive there was to make it look like I was in school without actually being in school and bunking off most of the classes. A lot of the time I spent in a park, just watching the world go by, literally in a willow tree overlooking a lake, watching birds, watching people, watching out for the truant officers. And once they'd gone by, I could just walk home. And so I was really keen on observation and understanding systems, how things work. And so then I just put that to the food growing system. Well, how is it nature grows food? And I thought to myself, we human beings, we weren't born doing agriculture. There was something else before then. And, and so I started thinking about how is it that nature had given us food for millions of years before we started agriculture. And as such, just started looking at those patterns and then thinking, all right, so what are the key things that my parents have to do which constitutes work in the garden? Well, planting seeds, seeding things on, putting them into bigger pots, bigger pot until it's time to put out. You put it out, frost comes, kills half of them, start again. And all this, okay, how can I avoid that? What if I have perennials? So what kind of perennials could I have? And then weeding. Why do weeds come? And what are weeds? And I worked out that, well, just weeds are just plants that are just trying to protect the soil. When humans bare the soil, it's just nature's way of saying, oh, don't worry, I've got this, I'll cover you. Don't worry, don't panic. Hey, there you go, all nice and covered again. And so then I started thinking, well, what kind of things could I use to cover the ground that could also benefit the plants that I'm growing as well as benefit me? So then started doing ground cover. What about watering? And, when I noticed trees, if you go to the edge of a forest, no one ever goes with a watering can or a hose pipe to water them. No one goes with a load of manure to kind of fertilize them. They just work. So, okay, so trees will... So I started planting trees. And bit by bit, so got the water management under control, got the weeding under control. And the one thing that I didn't totally think through on my own was the nutrient requirements. So meaning I had a rough idea, well, I need to put some things that accumulate nutrients, but I didn't have any form of way of truly calculating how much. So I put some stuff in, whatever I thought, and pretty much, for years and years and years while my parents were still alive, that garden just fed them. And I remember a university professor once, we were having a conversation, and I was saying, I don't know what to do with all the apples I've got this year. He said, what do you mean there's no apples in the whole of England this year? I said, no, I've got so many. He said, that's impossible. There was a late frost or an early frost. It killed all the apple blossom. And there's no apples anywhere in England. I said, come and have a look. So he came over. And I showed him. My mother was still alive. My father had passed away by then. My mother was still alive. And I went to go and collect some, I think, lemon verbena to make some tea for him. And as I was coming back in, I heard him ask my mum this question. He said, how much time do you spend working in the garden? And it's almost like I gave my mum a script. It was just, her answer was perfect. So I stood back just to listen. They didn't know I was there, just to listen to see what my mum would say. He said, no, I don't really work in the garden. Who works there then? Well, nobody. Well, what do you mean? I mean, who seeds? Who plants the seeds? Well, no one. It's just perennial. It's whatever's there, and a few weeds come and, well, okay, you must be weeding then. No, because Rakesh says leave them alone. And, when he comes, he says, oh, you can make soap from that one. You could do that with that. That's medicine. And so I just leave the weeds, whatever comes along. And he goes through all the watering. Yeah, well, we've got this big water collection system, but to be honest, I just use it just to wash my hands. We don't actually water. It just takes care of itself. And he went through all these things. And in the end, he got fed up. He said, so what do you do then? And he says, I just go out every day and I just harvest stuff. And that's it. And it was such a perfect answer. And that for me really, that was my discovery of forest gardening. I made a forest garden before I even knew what the word forest garden was, because it's just logical. It's just working with nature. And as I say, it allows all the different animals and insects. It still allowed my mum and dad to be able to watch all the birds and the squirrels and, and nature just to be part of it and not separating. The other thing my mum really noticed when she said, when we first came to this country, it was really easy to grow food because there were so many birds. So now there's no birds. And now there's so many slugs. Whatever you plant just gets destroyed. And true enough, I planted a fig tree. Can you imagine? A fig tree. And for 5 years, the slugs would just keep eating that fig right down to the last bit of... I mean, it was amazing. It was really amazing how tenacious they were. And yet then I planted a hazel tree next to it. That took off. And then in that protection, somehow... the fig tree grew. And I don't know quite what was going on there, but somehow that fig tree grew. And then 5-6 years later, I actually had a fig tree. But I just thought, this is dead. 5 years, and it's not even, it's not even 1 foot tall because the slugs just keep eating it. But it's just that watching nature and just allowing nature to be. And so for me, this way of food growing is just so obvious because it's really low maintenance for humans, but more importantly, it encourages animals and insects to be part of the ecosystem. That's it for now.
Sanjana, earlier you mentioned reviving traditional ecological knowledge. What role do indigenous communities and ancestral practices play in the food forests you're restoring?
So when we talk of reviving traditional ecological knowledge, what I'm essentially talking about is honoring the wisdom of communities who have lived in sync or in relationship with land for generations. And in the forests that we restore, the lands that we restore, that their practices aren't an addition to the work essentially. They're the foundation of it. At least in Maharashtra and the Sayadri and the part of the valley that I have lived and worked in, the local farming communities have always understood forests as living systems. And I think that that's how most indigenous communities across the world have. They know which species grew together, which plants heal the soil, how the water moves through the landscape, and how to harvest without essentially depleting anything. They've protected these sacred forests, maintained seed diversity, and created farming practices that are regenerative by design. And I have worked with farmers who've brought up water on 500 feet high hills where they reside from the rivers downhill without any machine or any device, simply by working with the design of the land, understanding gravity and inertia intuitively. So when we restore food forests, or when I understand or explore land and soil, I start by listening to elders, to women who are essentially the real custodians of seed knowledge within communities, to the rituals and stories linked to very specific plants and trees, the stories associated with what we call ethnobotany in modern science, stories associated between the plant, the connection between the plant and the human. And many of these decisions of what to plant, where to plant, when to plant, whether to intervene or not, come directly from these ancestral insights. And modern ecology or academic research, for that matter, often confirm what we've already known intuitively for generations, for centuries sometimes. For example, in one of our restored patches, and we see this in most restored spaces, the pattern of multi-layered planting. There's trees, there's shrubs, there's creepers, there's herbs, and then there's root plants. All of them come from traditional forest farming systems and the idea of leaving certain zones untouched. And here, if I have to translate the word, they call it Devachi, God's pathways. It's also an indigenous principle, again, that ensures wildlife movement is untouched and there's natural regeneration in those spaces. So the role of indigenous communities, for me, is central in regeneration and also biodiversity management, protection, all of that. They're knowledge keepers, they're holders of knowledge, they're co-designers, and in every way possible, the long-term custodians of these landscapes. And my work, how I imagine it to be, is to create space for that knowledge to be protected, to be practiced, to be respected, and passed on. If anything, the forests that we restore are, for me, a tribute and a reminder that sustainability isn't new. It's ancestral, and stepping onto soil for me always reconnects me to that lineage of knowledge, wisdom that lives in land itself and reveals itself only when I know that I'm attuned to a consciousness that also aligns with the land. Yeah.
Rakesh, you live in London and your students come from all over the world. What does food forestry look like in these different settings? Like, for example, in London, where you live in urban settings, but also the rural settings or eco-villages where you work.
First of all, just to echo what Sanjana beautifully said, is we have to remember that while, food forests in the UK as a European thing, it started with Robert Hart, who was inspired by going to places like India, Kerala in particular, and noticing and seeing these ways that people were growing food in different parts of the tropics that was completely in sync with nature. So all of the, and we can see that, this has been happening for thousands of years across the globe, not just in India and Asia, but all the way across, in Abhyayala. We can see how, as Sanjana beautifully put, this is just part of their culture. This is the pre-colonialized culture. It's the predominant culture for living in harmony with your surroundings, as opposed to using, abusing, and exploiting nature for your own benefits. There's nothing new in forest gardening. There's nothing new in this way of engaging and respecting and being part of nature. But many, I'm absolutely certain there would have been practices here in the UK, which have been suppressed by the dominant peoples. There's a lot of culture here that probably was completely, totally in respect of nature. And so it's about going back to that and honoring that and seeing that, learning from that. So what permaculture for me and forest gardening is for me is just a route back into that. So for me, my definition of permaculture is actually it's just common sense in a world where sense is no longer common, or for a world where sense is no longer common, meaning where people can't see this common sense of really living in harmony with their surroundings and nature. They need some door back into it, and that's what permaculture helps them with. But otherwise, it's been there for generations and generations and generations. So to answer your actual question, first of all, as you know, I don't actually spend a lot of time in England. A lot of the time I'm teaching abroad. So in Europe, in Asia, so looking at these amazing, incredible forest gardens they're just gardens. There's not a special term for it. It's just what we do. It's just my front garden. It's just my back garden. It's not a thing. It's not a movement. It's just my garden. And so I see many things all over the place. And what I see is, you obviously have the bigger scale kind of agricultural, something which is for a business. So agroforestry style, where people are looking to earn a livelihood from this. So that looks very different in terms of it's, a lot more kind of straight, so that it's easier, or in blocks, so it's easier for people to harvest, but still with huge amounts of biodiversity and diversity of plants within each block. And then you have the kind of smaller scale, the kind of back gardens, which ultimately in England, that's where forest gardening started, because Robert Hart said, well, I'm not going to be able to convince farmers to grow trees and replace their fields. So what's the next biggest available piece of land in the UK that we can influence? Well, people's back gardens. So how is it that I can make and help people to see why they should be growing more trees in their back gardens? Well, what if there was some yield? What if there was some food? And how can we do this? But everyone's too busy. They just don't have the time to do that. So how can we make it so that it's really, really low maintenance? So this was his driving. This was the inspiration behind forest gardens as a movement in the UK, which obviously has now spread much further. But it was completely, totally inspired by, as I say, by his investigation around the world, especially in the tropics. And so there's a different scale of when you're just doing it at home. It's nice and cute and really messy, and it's beautiful in that messy way. So it's full of life. And then you've got some, intermediate trees. You've got like small farms, city farms. You've got a lot of my work is creating community forest gardens in places like public parks. And in fact, we've got a huge project in Europe where we're making 15 to 17 community forest gardens around Europe, which will be monitored for 10 years by various universities and the European Union to help to influence policy around food growing and around biodiversity and ecology, etc., etc. So each scale is different, and for me, the community forest gardens are just the most beautiful way, because as we know, in a lot of Europe, community, people coming together is a real challenge. It's people are becoming more, isolated. And, as we see constantly in the media about how dangerous the world is, and, if we believe the media, then every single person out there is out to get you and la, 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 all this nonsense. And I keep reminding people that as I travel the world, I see infinitely more amazing, beautiful, loving, caring human beings than I ever do see evil people. So let's just concentrate and work with them, and let's bring them together, and maybe we'll bring those few evil people along our path as well. So let's just keep putting that love back into the world, And so, yes, so creating community forest gardens, all of a sudden we see, Jews and Muslims and Christians, Rastafarians, Zoroastrians, and, just everyone coming out, Catholics and Protestants and just all being together, helping each other, caring for each other, and, especially the way in which I make my forest gardens, I give different people different sections to kind of be custodians of. So when they learn something, they get so excited, and then another, oh my God, have you seen this? Well, try this. And just that excitement and that beauty of sharing something with someone else, knowing that they have helped someone else learn something. It's just so beautiful. They may have only learnt it 5 minutes ago, but they're sharing it, and just the joy in their whole being of when they're sharing with someone else. For me, this is really beautiful. And seeing that actually culture, religion, and what have you, it's just human beings being with other human beings and being in love with their surroundings and nature, and watching the animals, the squirrels and what have you, just be part of the ecosystem. That's what I get from, that's what I see, and that's what I get from a lot of these forest gardens.
All right. So at this point, let's explore the practical side. Like, food forests might seem complex to people who haven't experienced them. Could you help us understand how you design, implement, and maintain these systems? So we'll start with Rakesh. Please, could you talk to us through a design process when creating a food forest, where you would begin, so that the audience can also follow?
Well, for me, it's really easy. The first thing to do is really to study nature and to see and look at how nature creates richness and abundance in your local area. So quite literally, we'll go to a forest and we'll just look at the edge of the forest. This is in the temperate climate. Obviously, it's very different in tropics. But in the temperate climate, we'll go to the edge of that forest and just see what's happening, what's going on there. And we'll just break it down. We'll look at the patterns, and I'll explain all the different patterns of how nature has created that richness and abundance, where it got its water from, where it gets its nutrients from, how, the biodiversity really is essential in all of those. So by breaking it down and really getting people to see it in reality, to actually see how a forest garden works. We then, how nature creates its own forest gardens. We then look at why is it that forest garden, it doesn't have the same kind of foods that we would expect. It has small, tiny little crab apples instead of big, juicy, golden delicious or Granny Smith's apples. It has Prunus spinosa, wild, small plums rather than big, juicy plums. So once we start to understand the pattern of how, why does nature create fruit in the first place? What is the purpose of that fruit? The fruit is there in order for nature for each plant, each tree to reproduce itself. So it only needs to produce enough fruit to get something to eat it, to carry it away so it can poop it away, and, a nice dollop of poop, and it back into the ground and allow it to grow. And it's because you cannot guarantee how many seeds will actually ever germinate. You need more seeds than will actually take. So if you've only got a certain amount of nutrients in the ecosystem, it means that the amount of nutrients available to the plant to actually produce fruit is limited. And so the plant has a choice. Do I either produce 1,000 tiny fruits or 100 big fruits? I mean, those numbers are not real, but I'm just giving some kind of easy comparison. And so clearly, 1,000 small fruits gives you a much better chance of survival than 100 big fruits. And so nature doesn't inherently want to create bigger fruit in this temperate climate because of the availability of nutrients in the ecosystem. And so if we realize that it's nutrients that is the limiting factor in nature on its own growing bigger fruit, we then need to study the pattern of nutrients. So where do the nutrients come from? How do those nutrient cycles get created? So once we study that and we see the different types of plants, the different animals, the different insects that are involved in this, and we design that into our food forest, then we can start planting bigger fruit, knowing that there'll be enough nutrients for each plant to really thrive. And so this is my starting point. So I just get people to look, see, observe wherever they are. And obviously, if you're on one side of a hill, it's completely different to if you're on the other side of the hill. If you're in the north of England, it's totally different to if in the south of England. If you're up in Scandinavia, I've just been working in Estonia. I've worked in Sweden recently and Finland. It's completely different to, I've literally just come back a week ago from Spain, which is, a completely different ecosystem. And so there's no one strategy that's going to, one technique that's going to fit every single, place in the earth, but there's certain patterns that do. So you just look, you see, you understand those patterns, and then you look at the specific species and the specific type of animals and insects that create the ecosystem that allow your food forest to really thrive. So this is my starting point. It's purely observation. And obviously, when you go to certain parts of the world, especially India, where you have such an amazing, rich knowledge of plants, so when I go and teach in India, I'm not teaching, I'm actually learning. I actually go to villages and say, no, tell me. So explain to me what you're doing, because this is amazing. This is fantastic. And as they're starting to unravel all of the amazing wisdom that they have, I then start understanding and breaking that down into patterns. And then I can start asking, all right, so is there anything that is not working for you? Anything that's you're kind of struggling with? And whatever they then answer there, then we collectively start to look at, well, what if we did this? What would be the repercussion if we did that? Could that solve this? Could that solve that? So basically they then, with a few choice questions, then actually solve their own problems. But first and foremost, we're utilizing their wisdom. It's all about their wisdom. It's not about coming in with some other external knowledge that is better than theirs. It's about working with them. So depending on where you are in the world, your starting point is very different. In places like Asia and in the tropics, there's many indigenous peoples who have an incredible amount of knowledge. Whereas in the West, many, many, many people are so disconnected from nature that they need educating, that they actually need a lot of guidance to actually be able to reconnect with nature, to be able to see these patterns. The classic one is, when I talk about like the drip line and, where do people mostly water trees in the temperate climate? And most people will tell you they water a tree right by the trunk. And you ask, well, why? Well, that's where it comes out of the ground from, and that's where we see, and that's what we see other people do. Yeah, but why are you watering it there? Does that make sense? What does the tree tell you? And then I say, well, when it pours with rain, where do you stand? Oh yeah, underneath the tree. Why? Because it's dry. Oh yeah. So what is the tree telling you? Oh yeah, I don't want water by my trunk. Why not? And then we go through this whole process of, well, it's going to drown, it's going to suffocate, and and if you have water further away at the drip line, it's got much stronger roots. It's encouraged roots to go further and further away. So it's all about understanding and seeing these patterns, and just recognizing and acknowledging the patterns of nature, and then seeing how do I apply that to whatever ecosystem that I've got. So this is my starting point. And after that, everything is easy.
Wow, that's really interesting. While you were talking, I just fell on this aspect of pattern, understanding patterns. And I believe that if you understand patterns and we go by understanding nature, how it works and how it regenerates itself, we'll not have much trouble. As a matter of fact, we'll have less stress working with nature. And I really love the fact that you respect indigenous knowledge in your process. All right, so Sanjana, comparing food forests with conventional agriculture for a moment. Now, let's look at conventional agriculture, meaning those which might rely on annual crop supplying and chemical external inputs like fertilizers and pesticides. From your experience, how does a perennial system differ from this, and what changes does it bring between the relationship between man and land? Are there some changes?
Yes, forests, there are definitive changes in monoculture and as opposed to regenerative farming, in the sense that it can simply replicate conventional agriculture with a different set of species. If I have to also answer the question about how conventional farming works by simply swapping annual crops with perennials, if that's essentially the question. So there are models in India where people do that. And then there's a replacement of annual monocultures with perennial monocultures. And you see large plantations of teak or eucalyptus or even a single fruit species like mango or guava. And technically, this is still agroforestry because trees are involved, but ecologically it does not really create the complexity or the resilience that any forest for that matter embodies. So perennial monoculture is, in my opinion, not regenerative. It only extends the lifespan of exploitation. And any kind of regenerative activity, be it ecological, social, cultural, all of it requires species diversity, a lot of ecological strata, multiple ecological strata, various soil building systems, for instance, or like we spoke about earlier, habitats for birds, insects, pollinators, and also human management, which is relational and not extractive, which is respectful. And if we are going to replicate the logic of industrial farming, like single species or having chemical inputs and simple ecosystems or simplified ecosystems, for instance, then it doesn't matter what we plant really. The outcome is going to be the same: ecological fragility over nourishment and flourishing. So again, going back to our ancestral systems in India, like in Maharashtra, we have the Wadi system, or in the homes of Kerala, we have backyard gardens. More pastoral communities and tribal belts, we have something called the agro-horti-silvi systems, which essentially emphasizes on layered complexities. It's also integrating forestry with fruits and animal husbandry, and all of that happening parallelly. So they never relied on monocultures because people fundamentally understood and intuitively and scientifically figured out that land thrives on diversity. And the more integrated the models are, the more you combine agriculture with horticulture and forestry and animals on the same piece of land, you create sustainability. And these systems leverage and ensure that there's a synergy between different components that are coexisting. And so my view is essentially very simple. Agroforestry becomes regenerative only and only if it moves towards a forest logic and not when it's replaced with monoculture of perennials. Yeah. Yeah. A perennial crop cannot make a system regenerative. It needs a fully functional, diverse ecosystem.
Okay. Oh, that's great. Thank you for that, Sanjana. Rakesh, so this is for you. You were also on the Permaculture Association of Britain's Jedi Committee, looking at justice, equity, diversity, accessibility, and inclusion in the permaculture movement. What could a justice-led approach to food forestry look like?
Great question. So yeah, first of all, we need to understand why Jedi as a concept is really important and why we need to bring it into many areas of the work that we do, whether it's permaculture, forest gardening, etc. What we see is a lot of people who are often marginalized. Because of that marginalization, they don't live a nice, comfortable life where, they have a good income and they can just, so they often struggle. And in this struggle, they have to be very, very creative in how they survive. So quite often, many of the things that many of the people in permaculture, who maybe have had a more comfortable life, who are getting into permaculture because they want to do something which, fulfills their heart, etc., etc. Many of the skills that they want to get, they haven't acquired these skills because they've been comfortable, because they've never had to work out when your radio breaks, how to fix it. They've never had to work out how to grow their own food in their back garden because they could just go to the shop and buy it. They don't have to work out how to make their own furniture or fix furniture when it breaks, because they can just throw it away and buy another one. Whereas people who are living on the margins are often more creative because they have to be. And so many of these skills that people who are looking to study permaculture or forest gardening want are actually already within they're the communities that they have been excluding and they have been marginalizing. And because of the paradigm in which we live in, it's considered anyone who is poor, anyone who is kind of on those margins, they're inferior somehow. They are not as good as us. They are not as well educated. They're not as well X, Y, Z. And this continuous pattern of them and us, them and us, them and us, where the superiority, inferiority, etc., etc. And we can see this is very intentional, because while there is this them and us, then we can't get together. We can't see the joys and the what actually connects us. We see mostly what disconnects us. And through that, it's easy to foster fear, and through that fear, it's easy to then control and manipulate. And so by thinking about all the different people in your community, in your surroundings, who are marginalized, who are not fully welcomed, the more we take care of them in terms of understanding, finding out what it is that they need to really make their hearts sing. But in return, let's be friends. And friends share. Friends take care of each other. Friends, in communities, they support each other. And so this JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, accessibility, and inclusion, is really important, because it's a model that helps us to really deeply think about the different peoples in our societies who we're not engaging with. I've actually just released very recently, I've created a whole series of cards with some help of my roots and permaculture community friends, which really look at different aspects specifically that came from that JEDI. So from the JEDI project that the Permaculture Association of Britain created, there were certain findings that we looked at 4 different groups. We originally had 6, but we only actually were able to really deeply organize events and gather information from different people around 4 different aspects. And so this first initial set of cards really looks at addressing those and taking some ideas that came from that report and adding some extra things, so that when people organize events, permaculture events, workshops, talks, or if they're making a design of a space, whether it's a physical space or whether it's a social event thing that they're organizing, they can walk through these cards. So it's really about looking at how is it that we can really engage, everyone in our community and really set up the spaces so that people can come, as well as accepting and knowing that, many of these people have knowledge that is really, really, really useful for everyone else to know. And they are really valuable members of our society. So this is why JEDI, for me, is really, I can go on for hours and hours and hours talking about this. It's something I'm really, really, really passionate about.
Wow, that'll be exciting to know. I mean, the way you speak about it, you are so into it, you are so passionate, you are deeply immersed into it. And I think it's a global issue with this aspect of justice, equity, diversity, accessibility. It's a global issue, and often than not, institutions and also policymakers, they just tend to masquerade it. They make it look like it's okay. Whereas if we go deep, you realize that there is still cracks. There is still that we versus them are going on, and that's really a problem, causing conflict in our community. Thank you so much for sharing, Rakesh. Now let's hear from Sanjana. Your works, especially the Bijvan's works, connects ecology and with the sacred. Do you mean it's a spiritual thing? Is it a spiritual way? What does this have to do with food forestry?
Yes, Boris, I do mean it spiritually, but not in a religious or a ritualistic sense. When we call a grove or a forest sacred, or what we are essentially recognizing is that it is a site of relationship, of reverence, of restraint, and sacredness stems from that space. And sacredness is what essentially stops humans from overreaching. It is this cultural boundary that then protects ecological boundaries. And in many Indian traditions, forests were never just ecological spaces. They were cosmological, they were ethical spaces. Food was grown with a sense of humility because people believed that the land was living, the land is living, and therefore deserving of our care. We are not entitled to the land. So that's the sacredness aspect. And food forestry is in so many ways a return to that worldview, that it demands the same qualities that a sacred forest will embody. For instance, the patience to grow, the patience to hold on and witness transition, interdependence, equality or equilibrium in a sense of non-dominance of one species over the other, which is also essentially the respect that we hold for all species, non-supremacy of humans. So that's food forestry and the sacred also being parallels, and an understanding that life and time is cyclical and not linear, like the industrial clock. Therefore, when I say sacred, I'm referring to that moment when you step into the soil and feel held by something which is older than yourself, which is extremely intelligent, and that feeling shapes how you design, how you harvest, or even walk through any forest or any soil for that matter. So for me, ecology and sacred are not separate. And because we are in an era of tech, and I've heard this sentence so many times that the future is tech, but I insist that one of the futures is tech. There are multiple futures, and food forestry is spiritual tech, one that reminds us of how to live in reciprocity. And there's something deeper in the way that we grow food in forests or understand food forestry, because it shifts our imagination completely. It shifts how we think, how we feel, and it is a reminder that food can emerge from care and ecological and emotional intelligence for that matter. So in contemporary times, when we are experiencing collapse, food forest is also an act of dissent, of refusal, that I refuse to participate in this destruction. And it's also an act of remembering that as humans, we did once upon a time live with the land and not above it. That's why it matters now. And that's why sacredness for me is so important, because it expands our sense of what's possible. It can also restore it. It has definitively helped me restore my capacity to trust and not hope. I find hope debilitating. I find trust much more powerful, not in any abstract way, but in very real, tangible ways of living and in holding truth and trust in the system that can outlive us. We also have to understand that we live on Earth for a very small period of time, and these systems have existed for thousands and millions of years before us and will after us. That's the connection between food forestry and sacredness. It teaches us to grow food without losing touch to our humanity and the essence of the spirit. Yeah.
Right. That's so great to know. So, and I can see, and I'm also learning to know that there are different layers of the future. It's not just about one side, looking at it in the perspective of tech as the wall is pushing down on us. Thank you so much for that, Sanjana. Right. So we just want to get on this take home. Someone listening to us who has been following us or want to start a food forest. What encouragement or advice will you offer? Maybe we'll start with Rakesh. Since Sanjana, you catch your breath.
Lovely, thanks. So what advice would I give to someone starting a food forest? So the first thing is just to look and observe. Go out into nature, wherever nature is at its most wild, in terms of where it has the least amount of influence from humans. Find that edge. Find and just look for patterns, look for how nature has created richness and abundance. And, be like that child. Be just fascinated. Just go in there and just allow your imagination just to go crazy and just and see things from that childlike perspective, and just keep asking, but why, 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 but why? You don't have to answer it at all. But just by asking the question, the universe will tell you the answers. The answers will come to you. And, for example, quite often I take people on wild food walks to show them different plants. And, this has happened several times where someone has said something like, wow, that's an amazing plant. How come I've never seen it before? I'm like, I don't know. How come you've never seen it? It's everywhere. So no, I've never seen it before. I've never seen it. It's just... I said, but it is everywhere. How can you not have seen it before? It's just everywhere. And then, whatever, a few months later, when I see them, they're like, it's all over my front garden. I've walked past it every single day. So what this shows me is that, what I say actually, for a good permaculturalist doesn't have the right answers. They have the right questions. So once you start asking the right questions, It has always been in front of you. The world, the planet has all of the answers. It's every single possible pattern for creating human and animal and, planetary resilience and abundance is there. Those patterns are so clear. All we need to do is almost just get out of the way of nature. We just need to notice what are the things we're doing that's stopping nature from creating this richness and abundance, and get out of its way, and it will do it for us. But, we can also add a little bit of design in there to make it a little bit more interesting as well. Yeah, so my advice, first of all, is just go out into nature, look, see, observe. Just go out there, enjoy.
Now, I'd just love to say a huge thank you to our two guests today, Sanjana Krishnan and Rakesh Rootsman Rak. Both of your stories that you've shared really highlight the incredible potential of food forestry and how they nourish not only people, but also communities and cultures, and also our relationship to nature, which, of course, as Sanjana said, we're not separate from. And of course, for our listeners who are curious to begin their own journey in food forestry or perennial planting, you can listen to the amazing wisdom of Sanjana and Rakesh. And as they invited you to look more at their teaching, you can find them online. And you can also find free guides and case studies and learning resources on the Realliance website, which are available in several languages. I just want to say a huge thank you again to our wonderful guests. I'm James Atherton, your host alongside Boris-Karloff, and this has been Realliance Radio. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode.